This lecture will address American politics from 1969 to 1981 and will highlight the presidential administrations of both Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter. We'll begin with an exploration of Nixon's background and then investigate some of his policy successes in both domestic and foreign affairs. However, a discussion of his administration must also include the Watergate scandal. Some of the highlights of Carter's presidency will also be covered. There are two questions you might want to consider as you follow this lecture. First, was the legacy of Richard Nixon's presidency positive or negative for the nation? Secondly, by 1980, some described the United States as a second-rate world power. Do you agree or disagree with this argument? Richard Nixon brought a unique background to the White House and years of experience in politics. Nixon was one of the most well-known politicians in the United States as early as the 1950s. This was primarily because he had served as vice president under the popular Dwight Eisenhower. His reputation was that of a conservative Republican. Some thought his political career had ended when he lost the presidential election of 1960 to John Kennedy. However, he just stepped into the background for a short time. In many ways, Nixon was most known for his strong anti-communist views. These were shown in his actions as vice president, but also prior to that when he was a member of Congress. We'll see how these views impacted his presidency in a short time. The so-called kitchen debate was part of the symbolic anti-communism associated with Richard Nixon. Here we see Vice President Nixon meeting with the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, in 1959 at the American exhibit in Moscow. Nixon defended the quality of American washing machines and television sets to an international audience. Nixon had a wide range of goals and had to address different concerns when it came to domestic affairs. One area deals with the environment. Deeper interest in the environment was sparked by the publication of Silent Spring in 1962. This was written by a former researcher for the Fish and Wildlife Service named Rachel Carson. In her book, Carson outlined the dangers of pesticide use and how chemicals such as DDT impacted plant and animal life as well as human beings. The growing interest in environmental issues is probably best seen when 20 million Americans celebrated the first Earth Day in 1970. While Nixon didn't agree with all the suggestions of environmentalists during his presidency, we do see several pieces of environmental legislation put into place. Among others, higher water quality standards were established to protect drinking water, as well as additional regulations to protect marine life and coastlines. The auto industry also faced new regulations when a ceiling was placed on the levels of pollutant emissions cars were allowed to put into the air. Finally, the Environmental Protection Agency was created by Congress in 1971 to oversee the new regulations and restrictions mandated by Congress. The Vietnam War, followed by spending on the Great Society, took its toll on the U.S. economy, as seen with this chart outlining rising rates of inflation. Nixon responded by cutting spending and raising interest rates. The result was the first recession since Eisenhower was president. Next, he tried deficit spending to stimulate the economy. This resulted in huge budget deficits. He also tried establishing wage and price controls, which helped for a short time, but in the long run, inflation continued and deficits increased. With another Republican in the White House, some wondered if Nixon would try to dismantle the Great Society programs associated with Lyndon Johnson. Nixon surprised many with his support for what came to be known as the Family Assistance Program. The Family Assistance Plan was Nixon's program to overhaul Johnson's Great Society and end welfare as they knew it in 1970. It actually wasn't as conservative as many thought, because it would guarantee a family of four an income of at least $1,600 per year. This was significant because $1,600 per year was more than most state welfare agencies were paying at the time. At the same time, heads of households who received these monies were required to enroll in job training. Essentially, this was designed to provide short-term assistance with money, with a long-term goal of getting people off of welfare with the required job training. While it failed to pass Congress, it demonstrated Nixon's centrist rather than conservative approach to domestic politics. Nixon also had to address many issues associated with foreign policy. Probably Nixon's greatest successes came in foreign policy when he ushered in a new relationship between the United States and communist nations. The new policy was called détente. In this context, détente meant closer and more positive relations between the United States and communist nations. We'll see examples of détente with both China and the Soviet Union. Nixon's chief deputy who helped him carry out these policies was a former refugee from Hitler's Germany who was also a well-respected professor of international relations. This deputy was Henry Kissinger. Over the next several years, Kissinger would hold a variety of positions within the Nixon White House. Détente was first seen with China. Since 1949, the United States had not recognized the communist government in China. Relations were so bad that Chinese Americans who were born in China were prohibited from traveling from the United States to China to visit relatives. Under Nixon, the United States began the process to normalize relations or to recognize China's communist government. In a major symbolic gesture demonstrating the shift in policy, in February of 1972, Nixon traveled to China where, among other things, he met with Chinese leaders and visited the Great Wall. Détente was also seen with the Soviet Union. This first began with a visit by Nixon to Russia in the summer of 1972. Two additional agreements also demonstrate the tangible results of détente. First, the United States sold 400 million tons of grain to the Soviets at below market prices. This made the Soviets happy, but it also made American farmers happy as Nixon found a new market for their goods. We also see SALT, which stood for the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty. For the first time, the Americans and Soviets agreed to place limits on the numbers of offensive nuclear weapons for each nation. On the left, we see a definition of détente, which was provided earlier. Now is a good time to offer some analysis. Overall, this was a tremendous accomplishment for Nixon, possibly one of the greatest of his administration. The key strength of both Nixon and Kissinger was that they recognized the split between Chinese and Russian communists. They used this divide to play the two powers off against one another. Who else could have accomplished this? Possibly no one other than Richard Nixon himself. Others would have been labeled as soft on communism. Instead, Nixon used his impeccable anti-communist credentials to adopt a new policy toward communist nations as he demonstrated an ability to act as a true statesman. Unfortunately for Nixon, while he did have several successes in foreign affairs, his administration will probably be most remembered for the Watergate scandal. To provide a bit of background to the Watergate scandal, I'd like to begin by defining some terms. The first of these would be CREEP. This stood for the Committee to Re-elect the President. There was nothing sinister in creating such a committee, but it turns out that CREEP was involved in several illegal activities. Nixon appointed his Attorney General, John Mitchell, to head this group. Nixon never forgot his very close loss to John Kennedy in 1960 and let it be known he wanted to leave no stone unturned to ensure his re-election in 1972. I'd like to mention two other terms. The plumbers were a subgroup of CREEP. Initially, they were created to stop leaks of confidential information. At one point, they broke into the psychiatrist office of Daniel Ellsberg in hopes of finding information which would damage his reputation. Ellsberg became a target after he leaked confidential information to the New York Times. Dirty tricks were the nickname for a series of actions undertaken by the plumbers to discredit Nixon's opponents and cause chaos within the Democratic Party. You can click on the hyperlinks below to find out more background information about Watergate and dirty tricks. This is called the Watergate scandal because in the summer of 1972, several members of the Plumbers Unit broke into the Democratic headquarters located in the Watergate office and hotel complex. They were caught in an attempt to discover the Democrats' strategy for the upcoming election. Nixon probably didn't know about the plans for the break-in ahead of time, but once he found out, he didn't go public. Instead, he tried to cover up the links between the plumbers who were arrested and his campaign. He also interfered with the FBI's investigation of those who were arrested. There are a lot of people who deserve credit for investigating the break-in and putting the pieces together in the whole Watergate scandal. Two of these individuals were Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, both of whom worked for the Washington Post. The two writers were helped by an anonymous source nicknamed Deep Throat. This mysterious source gave clues to both Woodward and Bernstein over time. The true identity of Deep Throat was unknown for 30 years. In the summer of 2005, Mark Felt came forward and admitted he was the mystery man. In the 1970s, he had been a top official with the FBI. In the midst of reporting over Watergate, Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, was forced to resign after it was discovered he had accepted bribes. Nixon then appointed a new vice president to take over following Agnew's resignation. He chose Gerald R. Ford. Ford was a veteran of Congress and a well-respected member of the House of Representatives. As members of Congress investigated the scandal, it was discovered that a taping system had been installed in the White House. Prosecutors eventually acquired access to those tapes. Even though one included a mysterious 18-minute gap, the tapes clearly showed the president had ordered the cover-up and obstructed justice. With the House of Representatives poised to impeach him, Nixon became the first president to resign on August 9, 1974. Once Nixon's resignation took effect, Gerald Ford became the new president. In a move which surprised many, in September of 1974, Ford issued a pardon of former President Nixon for any and all crimes he may have committed while in office. Nixon left office with a very mixed legacy. First of all, he showed tremendous foresight in foreign affairs. He demonstrated he was a true statesman by overlooking his past views concerning communism and establishing an entirely new outlook in American foreign policy. However, trust in politicians was completely shattered. Furthermore, the tapes and subsequent investigations revealed the Watergate break-in was just one in a series of abuses of power by the Nixon White House. Among other things, an enemies list developed by Nixon was revealed, as well as the administration's use of government agencies to harass opponents. The tapes also showed a president who used racial slurs directed towards African Americans and Jews. Many Americans began to ask, is the United States becoming a second-rate world power? Gerald Ford failed to win re-election as he was defeated by a politician from Georgia. The man who won the presidential election of 1976 was Jimmy Carter. It was in the backdrop of Watergate that a Washington outsider, Jimmy Carter, became president in 1977. He was a graduate of the Naval Academy and had served on nuclear submarines. He then returned home to Plains, Georgia, to farm and was later elected governor. He was an attractive candidate who pledged he would never lie to the American people and described himself as a born-again Christian. The high point of Carter's presidency probably came when he successfully forged a peace agreement in the Middle East. Let's begin with some background. In 1948, Israel declared its independence. Arab nations protested, and this led to the First Arab-Israeli War. In 1967, the Six-Day War took place. During this war, Israel captured the Gaza Strip, Sinai Peninsula, Golan Heights, and West Bank. This was followed by the Arab-Israeli War of 1973. Egypt and Syria attacked territories controlled by Israel as a result of the Six-Day War. Initially, the attacks were successful, but then Israel regained control over these territories. Carter hoped to bring peace to the region, so he called upon the leaders of both Egypt and Israel to meet at the President's Retreat, Camp David. The result was the Camp David Accords. In this agreement, Egypt became the first Arab nation to recognize Israel's government. In return, Israel agreed to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula. It was hoped that this agreement between Israel and a Muslim nation would lay the foundation for future peace in the entire region. We'll now explore some of the troubles which unfortunately plagued the Carter administration. One of the troubles facing the nation in the 1970s was an energy crisis. As you can see from this chart, beginning in the 1970s, the price of gasoline skyrocketed. In 1970, it averaged about 35 cents a gallon. By 1979, it was about $1 a gallon. The increase in gas prices further influenced inflation. I had previously talked about problems with inflation linked to Nixon's policies. Well, the problems continued after he left office. When Carter ran for election in 1976, he talked about the so-called misery index. This figure represented the levels of inflation plus unemployment. In 1976, he described the misery index as unacceptable. Well, by 1980, it had gotten worse, as shown by these statistics. Economic woes were followed by a foreign policy crisis with Iran in 1979. From the early 1950s onward, the United States had supported the Shah in Iran as the nation's leader because he supported the United States even though he was repressive. In 1979, a revolution replaced the Shah with a religious leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini. Khomeini preached hatred of the United States. In November of 1979, 53 Americans were taken hostage in Iran. The following April, a rescue attempt failed, leaving 8 servicemen dead. The hostages were not returned for nearly 450 days, not until Carter left office in 1981. Many began to question the leadership of Carter in a crisis, and some began to wonder if the United States was becoming a second-rate world power. That concludes the bulk of the lecture, but I would like to talk about some concluding ideas. The latter half of this lecture addressed the presidency of Jimmy Carter. However, the bulk of the issues discussed covered some of the successes and failures of Richard Nixon's presidency. There are 2 ideas you might want to consider. First, was the legacy of Richard Nixon's administration positive or negative for the nation? Secondly, following the American loss in Vietnam, a presidential resignation, economic woes, and a hostage crisis, by 1980, was the United States becoming a second-rate world power? Both of these questions are for you to decide. This concludes lecture number 15. However, the next few slides will offer hyperlinks to more information as well as sources used for this lecture. Have a great day.